All right, APOS history students, we are going to begin Unit 3 with a look at our third president, Thomas Jefferson. All right, so as you take these notes, I want you to think about to what extent did Jefferson's administration and ideology or beliefs maintain continuity and foster change in American politics and economics from 1787 to 1812. So how does his administration keep things the same and how do they change? All right, so a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. He was a Democratic Republican. He was the first Democratic Republican president. He's going to serve from 1801 to 1809. Thomas Jefferson was a plantation and slave owner from Virginia, which is hugely contradictory to his belief statements that we read in the Declaration of Independence. He is a statesman. He is an assemblyman elected to the Virginia Assembly. He is the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He was governor of Virginia during towards the end of the Revolutionary War and during the early parts of our Confederation. He was a minister to France. He was Secretary of State in George Washington's cabinet, Vice President to John Adams, and then President himself. So as you can see, certainly his resume is impressive enough and certainly warrants him being elected president. He is a Democratic Republican, so he founds the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to Alexander Hamilton's Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists essentially changed their name to Democratic Republicans. After John Adams issues the Alien and Sedition Acts, Thomas Jefferson issues or is involved in the Kentucky and Virginia resolves, which promote the idea of nullification or the belief that states can ignore or nullify laws, federal laws that they believe to be unconstitutional. In his inaugural address, he says, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." So we start to see the trend of presidents wanting to unite a deeply divided country. He is definitely considered to be a Renaissance man. He's an inventor, a philosopher, an architect, a scientist. Interestingly, he also lives a very lavish lifestyle and dies ultimately in debt. So now that we've talked about the man, we need to talk about the concept of Jeffersonianism. So Jeffersonianism is a belief in republicanism and civic virtue, doing your civic duty of voting, and belief in a right to education, a focus on natural elites and resisting corruption. A belief in federalism, which is sharing the governing responsibility between the central government and state governments. He's a strong supporter of states' rights, believing that ultimate sovereignty belongs with the states and that states have the right of nullification. He's a strict interpretationist of the Constitution, meaning he believes that the only things that are legal are things that are written word for word into the Constitution. He believes in a dominant legislature and a weak judiciary branch, and he believes in economic coercion over standing armies when it comes to how he's going to deal with foreign policy. He believes in yeoman farmers as ideal citizens and that our economy should be an agriculturally based economy. He believes that educated landowners exemplify the independence and virtue that make up the American spirit. He's agriculture over manufacturing and industry. He believes in the responsibility of subsistence farming and that dependence is going to lead to class conflict. He wants an empire of liberty and foreign policy, so he believes that it is America's responsibility to spread democracy around the world while also maintaining Washington's view on avoiding entangling alliances. In society, he believes in the concept of Republican motherhood, which is the idea that it is a woman's responsibility to raise and educate good American citizens, but that they should be absent from politics. He believes that natives are capable, they just need to catch up with the concept of noble savages. He does believe in black inferiority and white superiority, and he believes in the separation of church and state. So the question is, was Jefferson Jeffersonian? Consider the following historical concepts. So as we go through this, how he approaches the federal judiciary, the Louisiana Purchase, his negotiation with the Barbary and Tripoli pirates, and his actions with the Embargo Act of 1807. Do they stay in alignment with Jeffersonianism? So I mentioned that the first two political parties emerge out of the conflict between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So just to review, the Federalists, keep the name Federalists, they believe in strong central governments. They are loose constructionists of the Constitution. They want an economy that's focused on commerce and manufacturing. They tend to live in northern urban areas, and they believe that the rich and the well-born, the able merchants and bankers should kind of be in control of decision making. In terms of developing trade partnerships, they're pro-British, and they're going to live primarily in the northeast. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, are going to focus on states' rights. They're going to want strong local and state governments. They are strict constructionists. They want an agricultural economy that is going to be focused in rural areas. They want the voice of small farmers, plantation owners, and artisans to be heard over that of the rich and well-born. They are anti-British and more pro-French, and they're going to live primarily in the West and the South. So Jefferson and his actions with the federal judiciary begin in 1801. So Adams, at the very end of his presidency, appoints several federal judges. So if you remember, the Constitution allows the president to appoint or nominate judges to the federal benches. And he does this. However, some of the appointments don't actually get delivered. So some of the people that he picked to be judges got their job offer essentially, and some of them didn't. And one of the guys that does not get his job offer is a guy named Marbury. And so he sues Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State over the fact that he does not get his appointment to the federal court. Now, Thomas Jefferson doesn't want John Adams' federal judges on the bench because they're going to be more in line with John Adams' political views as opposed to Thomas Jefferson's political views. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1803. Marbury actually loses the case, but the most important thing that comes out of it is the concept of judicial review. And judicial review is the power that allows the Supreme Court to declare laws to be constitutional or unconstitutional. And this is an enormous expansion of federal power under Chief Justice John Marshall. So John Marshall says in his opinion, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And then we also have impeachments of John Pickering and Associate Justice Samuel Chase. Jefferson expands federal power substantially with the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1803, all of this land belongs to France. And initially, we're not so much interested in this land. What we're interested in is the port of New Orleans, because that port of New Orleans is going to be a valuable trade post for us. Jefferson initially sends negotiators to make a deal with Napoleon to simply purchase New Orleans. He wasn't interested in all of this yet, but ultimately the deal that gets brokered is that we get the port of New Orleans, the Mississippi River, and all of this territory for $15 million, and it doubles the size of the United States. In order to make this deal happen, Jefferson has to suspend his personal belief in strict construction of the Constitution and use loose interpretation of the Constitution by utilizing the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause of the Constitution in order to make the purchase happen legally. Of course, he gets enormous opposition from his opposing political party, the Federalists. He goes ahead with the purchase and then commissions Army officers, Mary Lewis and Clark, to explore the territory to see what it is exactly that we had bought. So I would like for you to stop here and read these two opposing viewpoints on whether or not the Louisiana Purchase should be approved or whether it should be opposed. All right, so Jefferson and the Barbary Tripoli pirates. So this is the Barbary coast. You have the Tripoli coast right here, and if you know the Marine song from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, this is what that song is referring to. So this was an incredibly dangerous area. It was heavily run by pirates, and Washington and Adams had both paid bribes to the Barbary states to avoid piracy. And then the Barbary states under Jefferson's administration increased those bribes, and Jefferson utilizes the U.S. Navy and the Marines to deal with the Barbary pilots, and ultimately a treaty is reached. And this is another example of the use of federal power that Jeffersonianism might not necessarily agree with. And then Jefferson also is dealing with another foreign policy issue with the Napoleonic Wars, which are Britain versus France. So Britain and France are forever fighting. They were fighting during Washington's administration, which results in the proclamation of neutrality, in Adams' administration, which results in the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it's continuing in Jefferson's administration. So the British and the French are both impressing Americans, and impressment is kind of a fancy word for kidnap or forcing into service. So what would happen is British or French Navy ships would board merchant ships and essentially at point of gun say either you can join our military or you can die. This is a hugely unpopular action that continues through multiple presidencies, and each president responds differently. Jefferson responds with the Embargo Act of 1807, attempting to use economic coercion to solve the problem. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibits vessels from leaving American ports for foreign ports, which basically means we will be unable to trade with foreign countries. The foreign countries are not at all hurt by this Embargo Act, but it is terribly, terribly difficult on Americans. In the election of 1808, Thomas Jefferson leaves politics for good and retires to his home in Monticello, and his Secretary of State, James Madison, easily wins the election of 1808. Charles Pinckney comes in second. The Federalists do gain congressional seats, but there will never again be a Federalist president in the White House. So James Madison is also facing the Napoleonic Wars. The impressment of American sailors continues. And ultimately, what Madison ends up doing is asking Congress to declare war because the impressment issue is not being solved. The reason for declaring war includes British impressment of American soldiers, the alleged British influence on the frontier, so essentially the British stirring up the natives, and other Native American conflict. And all of this is going to result in the declaration of war in 1812. So causes of the War of 1812, so the United States versus Great Britain, we have British impressment and the alleged British influence on the western frontier. And we also have a group of people called war hawks. And war hawks were members of Congress who called for war and demanded that we go to war essentially to save our honor. And these are going to include two people who are going to be incredibly important during the antebellum period leading up to the Civil War, and that's John C. Calhoun from South Carolina and Henry Clay from Kentucky. The Federalists are definitely opposed to the war. They are, and as are the old guard of the Democratic Republicans in New England, merchants are also definitely opposed to the war. And the War of 1812 initially is going to go very, very badly for Americans. The British don't so much ultimately lose the war, but the British just kind of give up on the War of 1812 because they're now fighting a war in America and they're still fighting the Napoleonic Wars with France. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is nobody gains anything from the War of 1812 in terms of territory. Nobody loses anything from the War of 1812 in terms of territory. British Canada remains the same, and the territory that we won during the Revolutionary War remains the same. The one thing that is unique about the War of 1812 is that the British do invade Washington, D.C., and they are the only foreign force to invade and attack Washington, D.C. They burn down the White House. And they have a really significant attack on Fort McHenry. The important thing that comes out of the attack on Fort McHenry is the Francis Scott Key poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, which is now our national anthem. The War of 1812 also includes battles with various Native American groups and confederacies. So the first is Tecumseh's War. So Tecumseh allies his confederacy with the British because he believes that if the British win the War of 1812, that Native Americans are much more likely to get land back from the British than they are from the Americans. After the Battle of Tippecanoe and the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh's confederacy is ultimately unsuccessful. Then we have the Creek War, which are Native American tribes in primarily Alabama and Georgia. They lose their war with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, and they end up losing large tracts of land in Alabama and Georgia to the United States. And so the war ends technically in 1814. So Henry Clay is among the negotiators that is sent to Ghent, Belgium, to sign the Treaty of Ghent. And the Treaty of Ghent officially ends the War of 1812 with no side really gaining anything and no side really losing anything. However, news of the peace travels slowly, and American soldiers led by none other than General Andrew Jackson attack British forces in January of 1815 at the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson crushes the British in this battle. And even though technically we don't so much win the war, we don't really lose the war, this battle results in an enormous sense of pride and nationalism for the Americans. It really makes us feel like we quote unquote win the war. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that there was some groups who were significantly opposed to the war. And in 1814, these groups hold the Hartford Convention, which essentially is an opportunity to say we really don't want to go to war. We are very much against this war. And they are putting forward a platform. And their platform is federal economic assistance for New England. They want a 2/3 congressional majority for embargoes. They want to change the requirements for state admission and declaration of war. They want to rescind the 3/5 compromise. They want to put a 1-term limit on presidencies and no same-state successors. Now, their reason for this is that Washington, with all the presidents, with the exception of Adams, really all of the presidents had been from the state of Virginia. So Virginia was really kind of running the table in terms of presidency. And the folks from New England were starting to feel get a little bit in their feelings about that. They did talk at this convention that New England states and New England groups might secede or leave the Union if their demands were met. This was really talked by radicals, and by and large wasn't taken very seriously. After the War of 1812, those that participated in the Hartford Convention are seen as traitors to the United States, and effectively this weakens the Federalists and is kind of the death knell for the Federalist Party. The impact of the War of 1812 is a huge growth of nationalism and a period of national unity. The period immediately following the War of 1812, so 1815 to 1819 roughly, is known as the era of good feelings. We see a lot of domestic, industrial, and manufacturing developments. There's an emphasis on national infrastructure or transportation improvements, promotion of professional military. We start to gain some international respect, and we're going to demand some international respect under President Monroe. The Native American tribes are going to be significantly weakened during this period, and then there's an increased drive to expand west and claim land as far as possible.